What surprised me the most was finding about the relationship between Stan and Gus, that it was physical, it was emotional, and that it lasted so long.
Good evening. Thanks for joining this American Inspiration event presented by American Ancestors, the Boston Public Library, and GBH. I am Margaret Talcott. I am the creator and the producer of this series, and I'm also Director of Literary Programs and Partnerships at American Ancestors. We are so lucky to have this partnership with Boston Public Library and to be able to present, with their help and support, this incredible collection of authors, one a quarter we've been trying to do in this beautiful auditorium. Moving on to formal introductions, my better half here at the library, Kristen Moody.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you all for being here. Good evening. Welcome from the Boston Public Library. As Margaret said, I'm Kristen Moody. I'm from the BPL's program team, and we're so glad that you're all here with us. Tonight, I have the honor of introducing tonight's featured author, Henry Wiencek. Henry Wiencek is a nationally prominent historian and writer. He is the author of several books, including The Hairstons, An American Family in Black and White, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award in 1999, and most recently, Master of the Mountain, Thomas Jefferson and His Slaves. Henry joins us in just a moment. First, Margaret will introduce the moderator, Curt DiCamillo, her colleague at American Ancestors. Margaret, back over to you, and thank you all again. Enjoy tonight's program.
Thank you, Kristen. It's a special honor for me and pleasure to introduce my colleague, Curt DiCamillo, curator of fine arts at American Ancestors. An internationally recognized authority on British country houses, Curt has written, lectured, and taught in the US and abroad on British history and architecture. Many of you, I know, have heard Curt, or better yet, toured with him. His art and architecture trips are truly fabulous. Curt's most recent book is a bestseller for us. It's pictured here, the first volume of A British Country House Alphabet, an historical and pictorial journey. We'll hear from Curt in the second half of the program when he and Henry sit up front here, but for now, come on up, Henry, Boston native, in your old haunt, and of course in McKim, Mead, and White's old haunt as well. We're thrilled you're here. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's wonderful to be here. I thank you, Margaret and Kristen and Curt, and I thank the Boston Public Library and American Ancestors for bringing me here, because I spent many, many happy days here. I was born in Boston in the dark ages in the 1950s, and after I had exhausted the resources of our branch library in the Old Colony Housing Project, where Whitey Bulger lived. I didn't live there, but that's where Whitey was, and I had to dodge his newsboys on the way back and forth. At age 11 or 12, I was allowed to get on the subway and take the Red Line into Park Street, and then get on the trolley and make that magical journey here to the Boston Public Library, where I just wandered the halls and read assiduously. One of the first things I managed to pick up at the open shelves, I discovered that Samuel Beckett wrote novels, which I hadn't known. And I remember the first words of Murphy, which set the Irish tone of my background in perfectly. The sun shone, having no alternative on the nothing new. So that was one of the things that launched me on my love of literature. But I'm talking now about my love of architecture, which came about very naturally when I moved south. My first job out of college was in New York City at Time Life, where I met the love of my life, who was here in the room. She was the most beautiful woman on the 17th floor of the Time Life building. But she was not all that interested in dates, but she loved to go for long walks. And she lived downtown, I lived up in the 70s. We would meet every weekend, sometimes on both days, and just walk together up and down the city, which in the 70s was in a state of great decrepitude. But here and there were beautiful buildings surviving from a glorious past, and there was a hovering deity over New York. This man named Stanford White, whom I'd never heard of when I lived in Boston, but his name was on almost everyone's lips. Anyone who cared about New York, cared about real estate, about history, about beauty. He was the giver of grandeur, almost like a minor Roman deity. There was Brendan Gill of The New Yorker was talking for years about writing a biography of him. He never got around to it, unfortunately. But everybody who lived on the West Side, as I did, whose building had columns and something like ours did, a rusted iron gate that wouldn't move anymore, would say, this is a Stanford White building. I live in a Stanford White building. And of course that wasn't true, but that was the part of his nimbus of the glory of Stanford White that still hung over New York. So I began doing research in his papers that were at Columbia. It proved to be a very, very complicated project and much beyond my skills at the time, so I put it aside. And then several years ago, I decided, partly or largely at my wife's urging, to go back to Stanford White. And when I went through the papers and the books about him, I was surprised to find that he had a very long collaboration with Augustus Saint-Gaudens. And when I began talking over the idea with my editor at Farrar, Straus and Giroux, she said, well, everybody knows Stanford White. Nobody knows Augustus Saint-Gaudens anymore. And I said, well, you will soon. And so now let me take you on the beginning of a tour here. Actually, the FSG did a beautiful job on the cover. I love that image of Stan with that kind of half sinister look on his face. You only see half of his body. But here they are as young men. Anybody who knows anything about Stan's firm, the fabled McKim, Mead and White, thinks that they were born old because the most popular photograph of them was taken in 1905 when they were all in their 50s. This book is really about these two men as young men. All the way, actually the book, because the records are so good, we are able to trace their relationship from the first day they met, about 1875, until the day that Stan died. The day that Stan died, Saint-Gaudens and he were sitting down talking about their last project together. They met cute, as Hollywood would say. Stan was walking down a street near Union Square. He heard a man bellowing the melodies of Beethoven and Mozart, and he thought, what is that? I love those tunes. And he ran up the stairs of the German savings bank to find a wretched little studio where the man on the right, who was 6 years older than he, was singing these tunes, and he was living in monkish poverty. He slept there in a crate. He had no money. He was virtually starving. He was constantly troubled with stomach issues. But he made these beautiful little bas-reliefs that he had learned to do in Italy in a stay there. And he said that his fortunes would change if one day he could win the competition to make a statue of Admiral David Farragut in New York, and it would bring him the money and acclaim that he would need to get married and also, to live. So Stan said, well, I'm an architect. I'm working on a church up in Boston called Trinity Church. I can do the pedestal. A partnership was born. And this is one of the scribbled cartoons that Stan wrote in one of their correspondence, the two of them rushing into each other's arms. That's Saint-Gaudens on the right, Stan with his wild hair on the left. Saint-Gaudens began as a cameo cutter, and I pulled this up because this is the earliest known work of his. He did this when he was a teenager. It's in the Metropolitan Museum right now. There's a story behind this. A woman came into the studio where he was working as an apprentice with a photograph of her husband who had recently died. She was heartbroken. She wanted a memento of him and handed the photograph to Gus and said, what can you do with this? He produced this beautiful, very, very lifelike image, and he began to feel that as a sculptor, he had the power to summon life, to relieve the burden, to relieve the pains of people who were missing something or who were seeking something higher, seeking a closer relationship with someone. This is the beginning of a talent that would soar in the following decades. The first time they actually worked together, they weren't collaborating, but it was right across the street from here at Trinity Church. They were hired by, on the left is the great painter and man of many talents, John Lafarge, who knew both of them, but he was in charge of the painting at Trinity Church, the interior decoration, and there is the great architect, Richardson. Richardson hired Stan to be his architect on site, to be his supervisor, And Lafarge hired Saint-Gaudens to do some of the painting. But Saint-Gaudens wasn't a painting, but he needed money, and Lafarge felt badly for him. This is the interior. There is a so-called lunette of St. James, and the kindest thing that an art critic said about that is that poor St. James looks squashed. Saint-Gaudens had tremendous talents in many things, but a painter he wasn't. But he was there really, Lafarge wanted to give him some money. There was a romantic thing going on in the background. Saint-Gaudens was engaged to a woman named Gussie Homer, who lived in Roxbury. Gussie, the winter was so cold, Gussie took off for the Azores, but her sister visited Saint-Gaudens very frequently here, and her sister was a very, very important influence later on Saint-Gaudens and left us some of the most important information that we have about him. The first real collaboration was the Farragut. Saint-Gaudens won the commission for it. He married Gussie, went to Paris, and started working on the figure. A year later, guess who goes over? Stanford White, and he begins working on this pedestal. Now, Stan was like an artistic sponge. Wherever he was, wherever he saw anything, he absorbed it. So the shapes of this pedestal are probably the first example of the Art Nouveau in the United States, because it came right out of France. When this was unveiled, the two men became famous on the same day. New York exulted over this statue and over the beauty of the pedestal. And they inserted a little figure of a crab down with their names on it, Saint-Gaudens on the top, Stanford White on the bottom. It's still there. That's my photograph from not too long ago. This is a bas-relief from the pedestal, and you can see the beauty of Saint-Gaudens' handiwork in this. And Stan designed the lettering. On the family side, on the left, you see Gussie, Saint-Gaudens' wife, their son, and their son Homer, who later edited Saint-Gaudens' reminiscences after the sculptor died. And this is Davida Clark, who was the sculptor's mistress and had a son with him, and her face became the face of many of Saint-Gaudens' sculptures, as we'll see in a few minutes. This is Stan and his family, not the monkey. That's just the monkey. That's his wife, Bessie, who was very wealthy. That's one reason that he married her. And their son, Lawrence, who was their only surviving child, and he became an architect in his own right later on. This is the kind of work that Stan was called on to do. This is the Metropolitan Club in New York. Not the best photograph, but you can see the refulgence of the marble and gold. This is what the multimillionaires demanded. They demanded glamour, and Stan gave it to them in spades. And he began to regard this as kind of a trap. He wanted to work with people like Saint-Gaudens, who were real artists. And he got a chance when he made this room with Louis Comfort Tiffany and several other artists. You can see this now. That's the Veterans Room in the 7th Avenue Armory in New York. And oddly enough, this is one of the first examples of the arts and crafts movement in the US, but at the time it was savaged by a couple of critics because it had too much feeling. They said, you should get rid of this guy, Stanford White. He's not a true architect. He's too full of feeling and emotion. Get rid of him. But you couldn't get rid of Stan, not in New York. That's the Stan's caricature of himself. It really captures his personality. This is another collaboration. They did this in Springfield. This is for the Chapin family. This is the Puritan, a very ambiguous statue. It doesn't look like it in this, but there are some people who actually claim this is a satire. But I talk about that in the book. Stan did the setting for this. That's how they worked mainly, is that Saint-Gaudens would do the figure and Stan would do the setting. Stan, as time went on, became more and more involved with very high society in New York. If you're watching the series The Gilded Age, this is what it looks like. That was the real thing. Stanford White is the very tired, worn-looking man, the tallest person in the back row, and the others look like they're having a fine old time, but Stan just looks worn out. He worked all day and pursued young actresses all night. These pictures bring us into the depth of feeling and emotion that Saint-Gaudens was called upon to depict in sculpture. On the left, you'll see Clover Adams, who was married to Henry Adams. They're both, from the Massachusetts family. oddly enough, Henry Adams had come to Trinity Church almost every day to watch it being built because he was teaching architecture at Harvard. But also the idea for a novel was coming into his mind. Both he and especially his wife really no longer had any interest in the Christian faith. They were becoming very interested in Buddhism. Like many upper-class Bostonians, they were interested in different modes of faith, partially because Darwinism had taken an axe to Christianity in the U.S. And this is the result for it. Poor Clover suffered more and more from depression, and one day she took her own life. And Henry Adams and John LaForge went to Sant-Gaudens studio in New York and said, "We'd like you to make a monument in honor of her, and it must be a Buddha statue." Well, this was a toxic assignment for Sant-Gaudens because all his life he suffered terribly, terribly from depression. And he once said, "Not a day goes by when I don't think of taking my own life." He said that he felt himself always being pursued by this terrible darkness, these implacable forces that make life sad and miserable. And the way that I, Sant-Gaudens, fight against it is to make the images of truth, beauty, the beautiful things. And so this is the result. You can see that it captures sadness, it captures the end of life, but it also sends a strangely positive message in this in settings. Stan designed this setting where the only opening really is to the sky. So one's feelings looking at this soar. They rise. You can't stop it. And yet you feel yourself in the presence of loss. It's one of the times when Sant-Gaudens puts 2, sometimes 3 meanings into the same figure or in the same location. He did this with some of his war memorials. They are both about life, death, they're about heroism, they're about failure at the same time. You can see all of these things there. And there is another doubleness here. People at the time said, "We cannot tell if that face is the face of a man or a woman." And Jeannie, the woman I mentioned, the sister-in-law, said that when she was sitting in the studio with Gus making this, he was very depressed, and she said that he told her that the figure is genderless, absolutely genderless. And when he was writing it took so long for this, I just want to read a brief quote. Adams got furious with him and wrote, when it was still not quite finished, he said, "Formerly in Hawaii, whenever a new house or temple was built, a human victim had to be killed to be put under its first post. If I could, I should club Sant-Gaudens and Stanford White and put them under their own structure. Nothing has distressed me like their outrageous disregard of my feelings in this matter. Never spare an architect or artist hereafter. Make their lives intolerable." So he was on the other side of the world in Tahiti when this sculpture was unveiled, and his friends in Washington, which is where it is located, went to see him and wrote, a painter said, "It is one of those works, and few there have ever been of them, whose existence is part of nature's plan." She said, "The subject is silence itself, that Sant-Gaudens seems to have entered upon a mystery and returned with the secret in bronze and granite. The uncommunicable is offered to the human heart and intelligence without word or gesture, but with a poignancy and conviction that only supreme oracles can command." And the same year that he made that, Stanford White and Sant-Gaudens collaborated on this. This is the famous Diana, whom this was the only nude that Sant-Gaudens ever did. But it's really strange in my mind that in one year he does a statue that's the ultimate of the end of life, the end of vitality, the end of sexuality. At the very same time, he's doing this. And there she is. And the face is that of his lover, Davida Clark. The body was from a different model because Davida was pregnant with his child at the time he was doing this. And this is the scene that begins the book. This is the taking down of of Diana in 1925, and I make a little bit of a leap at the beginning of the book. Not really. I said the New York's Gilded Age came to an end in May 1925 when this statue was reverently lowered 340 feet from the top of Madison Square Garden, which Stanford White had designed. And as many of you know, in 1906, he was shot dead on the roof of Madison Square Garden during a performance of the play Mamselle Champagne. He was shot by a depraved millionaire whose wife Stanford had seduced, raped, when she was about 17 years old. The most famous, perhaps the greatest, there are arguments, but the most famous work of Saint-Gaudens that's here in Boston is the Shaw Memorial. This was the first set of ideas that Saint-Gaudens had. He was told that the Shaw Committee wanted to pay a tribute to Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, who had died heroically leading the 54th Massachusetts Regiment in a hopeless but very brave charge against Fort Wagner in South Carolina. And so he initially got interested in it because he was purely interested in the artistic challenge of making an equestrian statue, which he had never done. And so he made this. These are called maquettes. These are his first clay models. When these were shown to the Shaw family, they said, no, the colonel was a colonel. He didn't have high enough rank to deserve an equestrian statue. Only a general or a marshal or higher deserves that. Saint-Gaudens was sent back to the drawing board. And then he had the idea that he would show, in his words, as he wrote in his reminiscences, I will show the colonel in association with his men. Now, the easiest way for him to have done this is to do what he did more or less on the Farragut Monument, have a figure, and then in low relief have the black troopers in sort of generalized, idealized figures along a pedestal without any humanity at all to them, but they would stand in for what had happened. No, that's not what he did. He did that. These are real men. He went out on the streets in New York and Boston and begged men to come into his studio so that he could model their faces and their bodies and put them into this incredible monument to heroism. And the angel who floats over there appears very often in his work. She's a constant presence because it represents what I said before, his hope to find truth, beauty in the world, to overcome the terrible darkness that these men are going into. And he puts her up there as an inspiration. And his artist friends said, get rid of her. Get rid of her. She has no place in that. And he said, no, she's there. And this is the scene of the dedication on Beacon Street, right across the street from the State House. And there were actual veterans of the 54th who were there. And I came across a letter that I don't think anyone else had found, that the man in New York who photographed the monument or the models for Saint-Gaudens, when he actually had finished it. It was the finished product. The photographer took pictures, and when he developed them in his studio, he realized that the man who worked on the furnaces in his apartment building had been in the 54th. So he asked him to come up and look at the photographs, and the man said, yes, sir, that's Colonel Shaw. And when he looked over the whole scene, he said, and those are the boys. So I want to end with this. This had its origin in a group of statues of angels that some people think might have been his greatest work, Saint-Gaudens' greatest work, and he also, another collaboration with Stanford White, it was for a tomb in Hartford, destroyed in a terrible fire. It almost ruined Saint-Gaudens' finances. He would have gone bankrupt, except he got rescued in a very strange way. But the angel survived, and he made it into this. This has become one of his most famous images. It's called Amor Caritas, love and charity. One of these is in the Louvre, another is in the Met. I don't know if the MFA has one, but this is one of the works that he was proudest of because it carried so much hope. And so it doesn't carry a burden, it carries the fondest hopes of Saint-Gaudens for the best that we can achieve in our lives. Amor and Caritas. And I will pause there, and I think Curt can now come up and begin a little interrogation. So, thank you. Thank you all very much.
That was an amazing presentation, and I have read the whole book, so I can say it's even better if you buy the book. One of the things that I found very interesting that I learned in this book is that Stanford White, the pillar of establishment society, not only did he not go to college, he didn't even graduate from high school. And that's astonishing to me. And that's not a question, that's just a statement. It's amazing what he achieved, and when you read the book, you'll come across so many statements about his frenzied energy, the fact that he never stopped, which is why I think he prematurely aged. I'm going to start off by asking one of the most intriguing people in the book for me was Joseph Wells, who began his career here in Boston, working for Peabody and Stearns, which is a famous firm, and then ended his career at McKim, and White. His colleague, Cass Gilbert, who we'll get back to later, said of Wells, quote, "Of all the miserable, bilious, unhappy, pessimistic, misanthropic geniuses, he is at once the worst and the best." You tell us in the book that Wells was also the lover of Sant-Gaudens, and that Stanford White and Sant-Gaudens may have had an erotic relationship. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, that was something that emerged as I read the papers. At first I found the obvious evidence of their 3-decade-plus collaboration, but the more I read them, the more I found the undercurrent of a very strong physical relationship, an emotional relationship that began kind of tentatively and then sort of solidified over their lives together. And both men had many lives, both male and female, and Joe Wells was one of the people that they both fell in love with. Jeannie Homer, the sister-in-law whom I mentioned before, was in the studio with Saint-Gaudens when he was doing The Puritan. And Wells was always dropping in, and she said that, and she wrote all these thoughts after her brother-in-law died on the back of an envelope. And she said that Joseph and Saint-Gaudens were then very intimate, and she gave. It was a very strong indication of not just a professional interest, but a personal one. And the clincher for me was a cartoon that Saint-Gaudens drew of himself directing a small trio of naked men, and he was naked, and Joe Wells was sitting naked smoking a pipe. And there's an inscription in French, "My adored love, my beautiful girl, I love you, only you." And that was a private note that Saint-Gaudens had sent to Joe Wells. Wells worked himself to death, literally. He was being visited by a friend named Howdy Walker from Peabody and Stearns in Boston. Walker found him very, very sick with pneumonia, but still he insisted on taking Walker around for a tour of the buildings he was working on in New York, including Madison Square Garden and the Plaza Hotel. He was coughing so much and so weak that he sent Wells home. And Wells died alone in his room a couple of days later. And I found a really heartbreaking note, "Doctor, please, coming. I've had a bad turn. I don't know how much longer I can hold out." And he was dead the next day. The strange coincidence is that he died in February. I'm not good with all the dates anymore. February 1890, and Saint-Gaudens was heartbroken to lose this man who was his lover. And he said he called him as much. And it was in that same week when he was working on the statue of the Adams Memorial on the face, and he entered into his worst frenzy of make, destroy, make, destroy, make, destroy. Adams was furious with him, and he sent a note to Adams, "I've demolished the figure several times." And he wrote to Adams begging him to come. "I want you to look at the face. There's a lot I can do with the face. Can you please come?" And Adams refused to. And it was at that moment, that's when Jeannie was there, and she saw that he had made the face totally without gender. And it is my feeling that he put his deep, deep anguish over the death of Joe Wells into that face of the Clover Memorial, which no one, to this day, you can't say if it's male or female. It has no gender, it's universal. And I think it's because of what happened to Joe.
You tell us in your book, and you just mentioned these two things, that Saint-Gaudens' two most heart-rending works are the Adams Memorial and the Shaw Memorial. Saint-Gaudens' memorial for Clover Adams in Rock Creek Cemetery in Washington has been called, quote, the most beautiful thing ever fashioned by the hand of man on this continent. You add to that, quote, perhaps it is simultaneously a memorial to heterosexual marriage and to a lost male lover, a declaration that love's union has no gender and that it contains the unspeakable anguish of its maker. You've just actually sort of talked more about that, but if I had read my question and listened, I could probably head that question off. But I still think, for those of you who haven't been to see this, the Adams Memorial, the Clover Adams Memorial in DC, I have never experienced a sculpture experience anything like it. And it's not just the sculpture, it's also the setting, with Stanford White design, how you approach it. It's sort of like an outdoor room. And
Yeah, you're exactly right.
It's something that I think is beyond magical. I mentioned earlier about Cass Gilbert, who was one of the colleagues. He's most remembered to us today as the architect for the Woolworth Building, the Minnesota State Capitol, and the United States Supreme Court Building. He began his career at McKim, White, and can you tell us more about his time there?
Yes, I was surprised to find that Cass Gilbert did begin his career at McKim, Mead and White. He was able to get into the program at MIT, which was devoted to classical architecture. And he said that his professors there just cramped his mind down, and he quit because he wasn't interested purely in classical architecture. So he went to New York. He had made some drawings of Trinity Church. And so when he was sitting in the vestibule waiting to be interviewed, suddenly Stanford White appeared, looked through his sketches, and he said literally grabbed the sketches and ran into the other room and said, "Dummy," that was his nickname for his partner Mead, "hire this guy right now." So Cass Gilbert was hired as a lowly draftsman, and he was given the assignment one day of doing a big perspective watercolor drawing on cardboard of a statue that Saint-Gaudens was working on. The patrons were bugging him. They needed to see some progress on this project, and Saint-Gaudens wasn't satisfying them. So Stanford gave him this job, and he couldn't do it. He took the drawings home. He worked on them all week and came in and knew he was going to be fired because he hadn't done it. And then he said, in walked this wonderful man, the master, Saint-Gaudens, and he sat down next to Cass Gilbert and said, bring me some chalk, bring me some charcoal, we'll do this together. And he said, after an hour, even Saint-Gaudens couldn't do it. He said, damn it, I can't do it either. And Cass Gilbert said, I fell in love with him for the failures that he made. I could see that he was human. And then all of a sudden, Stanford White comes steaming across the room, and Saint-Gaudens said, stop, I know you're going to yell at him, don't do, because he used to do things like saying, this is hell, or this looks like hell, get out of here. But Gus stopped him from doing that, and he just said, Stan, nobody can draw this. Give me some clay, I'll make a model. And so Cass Gilbert was forever after in debt to Saint-Gaudens.
I think Cass Gilbert may have actually been more famous in his lifetime than he is now, because I don't think any of us in this room realize what a big thing the Woolworth Building was when it was unveiled. It was the tallest building in the world. Woolworths, of course, was the largest retailer in the world, and it was called the Cathedral of Commerce when it opened. Everybody flocked from all over the world to see this building, and Cass Gilbert, as an architect, had enormous fame. The closest I think we can come here to seeing a great Cass Gilbert building is in New Haven. He designed the New Haven train station, and years before I ever went to New Haven, I would take the train from Boston to New York, and in those days you had to change trains because they had, the track was only electrified to New Haven, and then you had to switch New Haven up to Boston. You got a steam engine, and so you had like 10 minutes while they switched the engines out, and I would run under the tunnels to go in to see the waiting room at this great train station. It's just a gorgeous building, and Cass Gilbert, like so many architects, has left bits and pieces of himself all around America. One of the things that I came across in reading the book, Saint-Gaudens' son Homer, who you mentioned earlier, wrote about his father. I definitely got the impression in reading the book that he scrubbed a lot of things that he didn't think was appropriate for publishing. Could you expand a little bit on that?
Yes, he definitely did that. Homer Homer Saint-Gaudens adored his father, and he took over his father's papers. Saint-Gaudens, Augustus Saint-Gaudens had started writing his memoirs before he died. Actually, he dictated them into Edison wax cylinders, which are unfortunately lost. I think they were all burned up in a fire. But Homer took over, and he ran across certain things that he didn't quite understand. There were references to this outfit called the Sewer Club. And he thought that it was a social club, and he mentioned it to one of his father's friends, Royal Cortisos, who was a critic, and he had worked for a while at McKim, Mead and White. And Cortisos said, "Get rid of that. That whole thing was repulsive." What it was is a private sex club that Saint-Gaudens and White were involved in down in
Jeffrey Epstein.
And yeah, right, down in Washington Square. But a lot of other papers were thrown out, and Larry White did the same thing with his father's papers for a number of reasons. They were to hide some of the less savory sexual aspects, less savory to him anyway, and also some of the social things. When I began doing work on Saint-Gaudens and White, they were involved with the Astor family, and some pages were torn out of the letter books where White had apparently written some unsavory things about a member of the Astor family. So that was those things had to be made to disappear. So both sons, they whitewashed the images of their fathers.
You know, one of the things that I learned from your book was, which I didn't know, was how much both of our main characters worked on Trinity Church. And you talked a little bit about this, but I had no idea as young practitioners that this incredible church, which I want to point out, is considered the most important church building in the United States architecturally. It's the only building that has never been off the list of the American Institute of Architects. Every year they list the 10 most important buildings in America, and every year since Trinity was built, it's been on the list. So can you tell us more about what they did in their young years working on Trinity?
Oh, it was really, well, actually, Stanford saved the building because Richardson's original tower was, the tower that he had in his plans was much bigger than the one we see now. And the committee, the church committee that was in charge of overseeing the construction, they got nervous and they hired a structural engineer, and he looked at the plans and he said, you know, this thing is standing on piles. It's not going to, the piles won't hold it. The whole structure will collapse because it's too heavy. Richardson at first refused to listen to this engineer, but the committee said, no, we believe him and you've got to do something. So he looked through, some people say Lafarge showed him a photograph of the Spanish tower, but anyway, he got his hands on a tower in Spain that he thought might work, and he handed it to Stanford White. And almost literally overnight, Stanford made a drawing with plans of a whole new tower. And he saved the project, and that's the tower that we see now. And actually, one of the interesting things about doing the research is I was able to find a diary that was kept by one of the leader of the church's committee, Payne. I can't think of his full name will come back to me in a moment. But he patrolled the church every day, keeping an eye on construction and costs and everything. And he recorded the tragedies that kept happening. If I can just take a minute, it was funny. You know, stones fell, tools fell, tiles fell, and then. Oh, this is actually one of the funnier things. In the background of the construction, I wrote a comedy was playing out. Though Richardson and the Reverend Brooks generally agreed on architectural issues, the architect was, quote, a violent atheist and argued incessantly with the rector on questions theological. When the esteemed preacher needled Richardson for never having read the Bible, Richardson went home and, quote, read straight through it all night long. The next morning, an assistant arrived at the studio and found him absorbed in his reading. He put the book aside and said, it's the goddamnedest interesting book. And Lafarge, the painter, commented on Richardson's ignorance of Christianity. He said, it's very curious how perfectly ignorant these Bostonians, Harvard men, are of the Christian religion. But So anyway, where's the thing I wanted to find? Oh, the other thing that both Stan and Lafarge learned there, well, actually Stan learned it from Lafarge and Richardson, was the necessity of what Richardson called doing a little fibbing, that you should never, when things are going bad, you should never admit to the patrons that things are going bad. It's exactly what you expected to do, and you should just lie, outright, and give them, what they called fibs and bunkum so they would just shut up and go away, and then you could do your work. But in the diary, let me see if I can find it. Oh yes, in Paine's diary, quote, Mr. Brooks had a narrow escape from being killed, a box falling down the tower inside, and he just escaped by jumping aside. I yelled, but he had heard some noise in time to save himself. Paine recorded other accidents. A huge stone fell 40 feet, hit the floor, and smashed into pieces that shot out like shrapnel and penetrated into the cellar. Several days later, quote, terrible accident, staging in the South Transept Falls as 4 men are lifting a stone of about 450 pounds. A 30-year-old mason died on the spot, leaving a widow and a small child. The 3 other men were injured, and one of them died 10 days later. And then, on another day, Henry Sullivan fell off staging by his own carelessness and was injured so that he died. It was interesting to me, being half Irish, that all the men who died were Irish.
Of course they were.
Yeah.
I'm going to say, as an aside here, Lafarge gets short shrift these days. What he's most famous for now is his stained glass. And he was every bit as good as Tiffany, with whom he was a competitor, and I think he does not get enough attention. The other thing I wanted to say, which is about H.H. Richardson, Henry Hobson Richardson, who designed Trinity, and even though we consider him a Boston architect, he actually grew up in Louisiana. But I think, for my money, he is the most original architect in American history. His style, Richardsonian Romanesque, was copied all over the world, and his influence is enormous. And he died, I think, at 48. He died very young. And I should also say, to give Stanford White some credit, when he decided not to graduate from high school, the reason he did that was to go work in H.H. Richardson's practice so he could get some hands-on experience. Because, as you can imagine, Stanford White never actually was trained as an architect, except for that that venturing out as an apprentice. Now we're going to talk to you some more, but I have some questions that we asked our online viewers to submit in advance. Of all of these questions, this is my favorite. In your book, you refer to the 1955 movie The Girl in the Red Velvet Swing, which fictionalized events surrounding the life and death of Stanford White. That movie starred Ray Milland and Joan Collins. If you were to make that movie today, who would you cast as Stanford White and Evelyn Nesbit? And this is the best part. Please note that Joan Collins at 92 is still available to play the love interest.
Yeah, I'm glad I had some advance notice about that question because it's a difficult one. Yeah, that movie was a total whitewash of what happened because Ray Milland, I guess, was in his 50s, but Joan Collins was then 24 years old, portraying a 17-year-old. So Hollywood was really playing fast and loose with the facts. Whom would we choose today? I think that Johnny Depp would be good for because he's a great actor. And he's the right age, and he also has that element of the sinister that Stanford White had. And I was talking this over with my wife about this, and I said, we would have to do what Zeffirelli did in 1968 when he cast Romeo and Juliet. He had to find a completely young, unknown actress, Olivia Hussey, to play the role of Juliet, but in this case, the role of a young woman who was desperate to get into the theater because she was broke, her mother was broke, and here was a man who was showering her with gifts, and so she would give herself up. Well, no, she didn't give herself up. Herself was taken, but you would need an unknown actress, I think.
That's a really good answer. Did Stanford White's partners resent his unconventional lifestyle?
No, I found no evidence that they resented it. I think it's because what Stanford was doing was very common among upper-class men at the time. Some of the richest men in New York and Washington joined him in his frolics. Actually, one of his wilder companions was Charles Flying Freer, who founded the Freer Gallery in Washington, D.C., who had made a fortune in manufacturing railroad coaches. And he came to the rescue of Gussie later in life when Gus making any money. But what Stanford was doing was not out of line with what other men were doing. So they would have thought, he's just doing what everybody else is.
Boys being boys. In your research, what surprised you the most?
What surprised me the most was finding about the relationship between Stan and Gus, that it was physical, it was emotional, and that it lasted so long. And some of the evidence is in notes that I can't say in this room because the language is too coarse.
When you read the book, one of the things that comes out is how protective Stan was of Gus. Protective in a really unusual way, in a good way. I think he looked out for him in every single sense, but you could very much see how that protectiveness could develop into a relationship. Do you know when the term the Gilded Age was first used and by whom?
Oh yeah, the Gilded. It was Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, who first wrote a novel called The Gilded Age, and so he was the one who named it. And Gilded is often misunderstood. People think that he was heaping praise on the era. In fact, he was saying it was an era of corruption. Let's say an era of corruption with a cheap layer of guilt. Gilding, not G-I-L-T.
Did Stanford White design any buildings in Chicago?
Only one. It was I think it was a railroad president who commissioned a residence for he paid Stanford White to design it for his daughter, and it's ironically on North Astor Avenue, I think. So, but the only one.
I'm not surprised there's only one there. We have this interesting question from Suzanne Hinman, who wrote a book called The Grandest Madison Square Garden Art Scandal in Architecture in Gilded Age, New York. And she says that you present the traditional defense that Saw, who shot Stanford White to avenge his wife's adolescent rape, was not in fact the reason that he shot him, that as he shot him, he said, instead of "you ruined my wife, you ruined my life." And I wondered if you could comment on that and what your thoughts might be.
Yeah, there is a distinction, a difference there, a big difference, and she writes about this in her book about Madison Square Garden, which I made use of, and a lot of what comes at the end of my book about Madison Square Garden I derived from her research, which was excellent. But there's disagreement over what Harry Thaw said to Stanford White as he approached him in the theater on top of Madison Square Garden. Some accounts say, "You ruined my wife," which makes perfect sense. The other is, "You ruined my life," because Thaw also believed that Stanford White had blackballed him at New York's most exclusive clubs, and that was the most important thing to him in his life. So not being there, not being allowed into those clubs meant that his life was ruined. But to me, the most important thing about that moment is that Harry Thaw plugged Stanford 3 times, and Stanford died instantly. So.
Thaw was truly insane. I mean, it wasn't just a passing thing. He got off because he had enough money, and he knew he was going to get off. But he was a nut job. So
he was a dope addict and a sadist. After he married Evelyn, he beat her so much that
nasty piece of work.
She had to stay in her room for 6 weeks in order to heal.
So my colleague Margaret is walking up the stairs there. If anybody in the audience has a question, Margaret can actually give you that microphone, and you can ask.
Did Stanford White ever visit Sant-Gaudens at his home in Cornish, New Hampshire, or they not, or was he never there? I've been to the site in Cornish, yeah.
That is such a beautiful place, and I write a lot about how that became an art colony. Sant-Gaudens was the first one to move there. The answer is Stanford may have gone there once or twice, but that's all. He regarded it was just too far to go, and he was so deeply involved in his Manhattan social life and other things. In summers, he used to go to a fishing camp in Quebec with his clients. He didn't visit Sant-Gaudens until Sant-Gaudens was very ill at the end, and Sant-Gaudens says, "Now you want to visit? Why didn't you come before?" So.
I think the key thing which you heard Henry say is that Stanford White never really liked being out of New York City. He was just a metropolitan animal, and he loved what he probably would call his metropolitan pleasures. Margaret, do you have? Up there, there you go, way up at the top there. Or down
Yeah,
here too.
Just a quick question. Related to what you've done on your research between Stanford White and Gus, are there other relationships that you found or that you know of similar between architects and sculptors or artists that are in some way enlightening and similar to what you found in your research?
Well, there were a couple of artists who were also involved in the sewer club. One was Thomas Dewing. I think that he and Stanford might have had some sexual adventures together. If you're talking about, I didn't find anything about McKim. Not that I went looking for it, but there in her book about McKim, Mead, and White, Mosette Broderick. Her book is called Triumvirate. It's a very, very good book. She says at the very beginning in the preface that the architects at McKim, Mead, and White were involved in a homosexual circle in New York. She doesn't mean it in a, she means it in a very neutral way. There's nothing wrong with it. She said they were part of a homosexual society in New York, and then she sort of drops the idea. She doesn't pursue it very much. But one of the interesting things about Broderick and why she's such a good source is that she obviously knows the leading families of New York very well, because she got her hands on documents and stories that I'd never seen anywhere else. So she knows things that other people don't know.
Yeah, just to clarify, I wasn't really talking about relationships of a sexual or social nature, but of an artistic nature, which I think is really more interesting. That is, between architects working with sculptors or painters from an artistic point of view or architectural point of view, not a sexual or social relationship point of view.
Well, maybe Curt can help me on this one. The artistic collaboration of these men was so close and so intense and so transformative for Saint-Gaudens. I can't think of anyone else, any other relationship like it. And the interesting thing is that Saint-Gaudens had almost no influence on White's work. White always knew exactly what he was doing. Also, Richardson went to Saint-Gaudens for advice and said Saint-Gaudens was the best person for judging scale that he'd ever met. But White definitely influenced Saint-Gaudens, but it didn't go the other way around. The other way.
Unfortunately, I can't add anything to that, except in researching my notes for today, I read that this was the first example in the United States of an architect and a sculptor collaborating. So unfortunately, that's where my knowledge ends.
Well, in my research, I've never heard an architectural historian allude to another such relationship.
Thank you. I can't but ask about our building next door. David Leonard, President of Boston Public Library. It is the other collaboration that all of the people that you've been talking about have a hand in. We think more about Charles Fall and McKim than perhaps the rest of the team, but Stanford White certainly is regarded as having influence over the interior decorations, and Sant-Gaudens shows up in many spaces, both the lines around the staircase as well as the seals. I'm wondering if there's anything either in the book or that you've discovered that you didn't put in the book about that intersection that would just bring it home for next door.
I don't know if White had any influence on McKim's work on the interior. He may very well did. I was saying to Margaret at the beginning here that before the event that we have White to thank for perhaps the McKim, Mead, and White being able to do it at all, because the Boston Public Library project went on for about 8 years. And McKim was so slow and painstaking that the firm made hardly any money at all. At the end of 8 years, their total profit for that whole period was about $20,000, which is not very much. And the last check didn't come in until several years after the building was finished. But in contrast, Stanford White had so many lucrative contracts coming in the same period. His projects earned $97,000 in profits. And as the historian Mary Woods pointed out in her book about the development of the architectural industry or architectural firms, it's called From Craft to Profession. She said without White's explosive creativity, McKim might have had to call the thing off, or would have taken even longer.
Well, here's a good question. Can you describe the process and sources for your research?
Oh, Lord. Visiting, looking. Spent a lot. I spent several days just looking at Trinity inside and out. My wife and I went to see the Adams Memorial. Of course, I got in to see the Veterans Room when it was really difficult to do so. I looked at as many buildings as I could, looked at as many photographs. The other thing was I had an immensity of damned microfilm to go through. Fortunately, all of Saint-Gaudens' papers have been, almost all of his papers have been microfilmed by Dartmouth, and I was able to get them on interlibrary loan at UVA, and I spent weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks ruining my eyesight looking at those things, but that's the way you do it. And I also looked at the papers themselves, sometimes at Mass Historical Society and at other venues, but it was just a long, arduous process of looking at every original document that I could find. So that's how it gets done.
That is how it gets done. Thank you so much, Henry.
Thank you to Henry and Curt. Good night.